So I spent the last week doing this, which is why there wasn't a video last week. I could have tried, but, you know, it would have been a bit messy. That's okay though, because what I'm talking about this week isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's seen as a positive if it stays the same. My voice may still be a bit funky, but I have to make a video this week. If just because I don't see myself missing 2 weeks in a row, I have to subsidize my addiction to buying figurines of myself. When referring to old games, the word classic is thrown around way more often than it should be, to the point where a term that usually refers to something that's held off the ravages of aging is used to mean old. I remember that classic video game, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Yeah, it's awesome. I think the Louvre has just opened up an exhibition about it. So what current games will become classics in the future? Hard to say since it's all speculation on something I'm not an expert on, but I think it's easier to see it as games that will age well. You know, sometimes you can look at a game that front-loads its graphics and think, yeah, that's not gonna work. What's a modern game? Let's say since 2010, I don't know. In an ideal world, we remember the games that have timeless mechanics or represent an era the best. That'll be an FPS game with shitty microtransactions then. So, evolve. That's just depressing. If there's one thing that I've learned from all of my years screwing around on the internet, it'll be to never trust anything or anyone. If you get an email from a Nigerian prince trying to ship you gold, don't do it, he's very unreliable. If you see a game review from IGN, just don't bother. If you see a game on Kickstarter trying to revive a classic game franchise under a new name, run as fast as you can in the other direction. Otherwise, you'll end up with a Mighty No. 9 or a ukulele, and you wonder how we have nice things in a world full of so much disappointment. In the eyes of some, for one reason or another, Kickstarter is damaged goods, where being associated with it is the start of a downward spiral. But not every game ends up like that. And not every game is like Shovel Knight. There's an interesting distinction between why Shovel Knight is so good and why other modern callbacks to older styles aren't so good, and I think you have to give a lot of credit to Yacht Club Games. They knew what they were doing, both in terms of making this kind of game and also managing a Kickstarter campaign. As we've seen elsewhere, both are harder than they look. So the tribute act to classic 2D platformers, which uses the same classic pixel art graphic style, will one day be revered as its own classic? Yeah, it's confusing, but you tend to get there by being a great game and aging well. I'm fairly certain that Shovel Knight is physically incapable of aging badly, unless video games of the future are injected straight into our stream of consciousness, which means that Shovel Knight's qualities that combine retro gaming with modern touches like achievements and a boatload of DLC won't diminish with time. More importantly, it's proof that people can put money towards a video game made by a fledgling company and everything can go smoothly. For every Mighty No. 9 in ukulele, we have Elite Dangerous or Shovel Knight, and sometimes you need one of these to rise to the top to show what good Kickstarter can do. It'll confuse the hell out of historians though. This game and this game were released 24 years apart. Fucking magicians at work or something, we must burn them. Given that every 5 or 6 years the video game industry focuses on a particularly trendy genre that everyone wants to be a part of, you'd imagine that it's hard for one game to stand out as a potential classic. It's like pouring fine wine into the ocean. Don't do that, by the way. It's gonna get diluted really quickly, and then you're left trying to separate that special game from the oversaturated genre it's a part of. But that's just it, isn't it? Every time the industry has obsessed over platformers or space shooters or military shooters, there's always been a few choice games that have risen to the top. What makes The Last of Us unique in that regard is, as zombie survival games go, it's a little unconventional. Mind you, it feels like The Last of Us can already be considered a classic, if just because of the award circle jerk that elevated it to legendary status straight out of the gate. Though, what's interesting about all of these awards is that very few of them heap praise on the gameplay, which is strange because that's usually the only thing that a zombie survival game has going for it. Putting the focus on story in this kind of game is like concentrating on graphics in a puzzle game. I wouldn't recommend it. Instead, The Last of Us puts a ton of effort into creating a harsh world with realistic characters who react in believable ways to problems as they come up. It still functions as a video game, but it's one that puts so much focus into capturing the desperate, gritty side of an apocalypse, and again, that kind of stuff tends to age quite well. Unless, of course, we actually do see a zombie outbreak in the not-too-distant future, and it turns out that it doesn't spread by spores. But I'm sure pointing out this inaccuracy won't be a priority. Might be worth playing in your apocalypse bunker if you can find time in between drinking the moisture from the air. Around the time when The Last of Us was receiving more praise and awards than any other game in history, I kind of hated that. But I only think I hated it because it took me a little longer than usual to appreciate this game for what it is. Not necessarily to the tune of 200 awards or something, but it is a very important game. It puts all the pressure on the sequel though. That game needs to be Game of the fucking Century. When you stretch a game out to incorporate an open world, you usually lose a bit of quality with it. Not to say that any game with a massive overworld is dead in the water before it learns to swim, but it's all about managing time and resources during development, and a few too many games get caught up in making a game big, but not necessarily good. It's amazing that some studios can't seem to grasp that quality has a slightly higher value than quantity, and that they have to wonder which part to focus on. Then you've got CD Projekt Red over here saying, why not have both? One of the awesome things about The Witcher 3 is that, like The Last of Us, it's a shining example of a genre that has been run into the ground through repeated mediocre offerings. What that means is that The Witcher 3's quality shines so vibrantly when compared to nearly everything else. This is a game that was built from the start with an open world in mind, so what you get is a game that is as wide as it is deep. I know graphics will fade and decay over time, but for 2015, a game that looks this good, with environments this beautiful, with so much detail in every area, it's like a plate-spinning masterclass, and you have to wonder how much CD Projekt are paying that octopus. Turns out that you can have as much quality as quantity, and that you can feel the scale of a world without it being procedurally generated. Everything the light touches is your kingdom, and you'll actually want to go there. It's how the world should be. There's a hesitancy to try new things in the video game industry, almost entirely down to that last word. Genuinely new ideas are always a risk because they could be terrible, and terrible doesn't ship copies. So when a company succeeds in trying new things, it's great for everyone, even if the new things are actually old things. We always wondered if there would be another Ocarina of Time, and for what it's worth, no, it's kinda hard to replicate transitioning from 2D to 3D as successfully as Ocarina of Time did. Luckily, Breath of the Wild doesn't have to compete with that since Ocarina of Time is already firmly classified as a classic. But it's also the last time, before Breath of the Wild, that Zelda took a big step forward. After that, every new Zelda game went about its business while constantly looking over its shoulder to make sure that it wasn't straying too far away from what ended up being massively successful for Nintendo. Breath of the Wild's over here like, nah, I'm eating frogs. I've barely got any hearts and no shirt, but I fancy being the final boss. Try and stop me. So Breath of the Wild shakes up the modern Zelda formula a lot, and almost universally for the better, but I wouldn't say that on its own is really enough to reserve it a place in the Hall of Fame. Luckily, it also did some fancy work for open world games by cramming a large world full of interesting shit to find. You can set off in a direction and usually find something worth interacting with, which further encourages going off the beaten path and finding your own way to a destination. It's also portable, which helps give the Nintendo Switch something that showed its technology quite aptly on release date, rather than leaving players to spend £300 to play snipper clips. Never mind the wizardry behind stuffing a world with this much going on into a cartridge the size of a cough sweet. You want to see the speed at which technology has advanced? This is what progress looks like. Also being able to eat censored food, that's pretty nifty too. The meme goes a little something like this. You play a new game with smart bits of game design that hint at extra thought being put into how a player interacts with their environment, and it providing a challenge from unexpected avenues, and do you know what game that reminds me of? The only other game I've played. Dark Souls. This is the future we've built for ourselves, where game reviewers don't need a thesaurus, they need to play more games. But you might be wondering, dear audience, how Dark Souls would be considered a classic years down the road if it's so much like every other video game that's ever existed. How does it stand out? Oh, it'll find a way. So it's easy and kind of fun to get caught up in the "duh, Crash Bandicoot is Dark Souls" thing, but we only get there because of how much Dark Souls shook up how people perceive video games. Not Demon Souls, because that came out in 2009 and I can't use that. You start off with impressions based off of rage compilations or stories about how brutal the game is, but you leave it with a great appreciation of how Dark Souls goes about balancing its difficulty. Every inch of progress has to be earned through understanding how enemies behave, what you can get away with within the game's engine, and respecting that on a first playthrough, you're going to be taking a lot of abuse from this game. Other games have tried to adopt a similar approach, which is where some of the comparisons come from, but you have to remember that Dark Souls has a lot more to it. How many other games can you name that have blended multiplayer and single player so seamlessly, or made it possible and acceptable that the audience will miss large parts of this game? Not to mention that, generally speaking, storytelling has become a lot more heavy-handed these days. It's not about nuanced themes and motifs anymore, it's about waves of exposition for a story that feels like an afterthought anyway. Then you've got Dark Souls over here being all subtle and building an engaging world without screaming facts about it in your face. That's kind of the main thing that people forget when they start making sweeping comparisons to Dark Souls. Maybe Crash Bandicoot has a similar method of telling a story, but I don't think it does. Maybe you should get better at a game that small children were able to beat back in the day. As Confucius once said, get good, son. This has been RabbidLuigi, and Dark Souls gets a reputation for just being difficult and occasionally being a dick about it, but you only get there by having a really good understanding on how to design your levels. Things like enemy placement, terrain navigation, shortcuts. You've got to have a really good grasp on all of these for your difficulty to be properly implemented into your game. But nah, every time someone talks about Dark Souls, it's all just about the difficulty. Did I ever tell you how Tetris reminds me of Dark Souls? Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn into a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.